The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Saskatchewan Pulse Growers and Nodulator XL. Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com for an episode of the Pulse School, and right now I'm joined by Jonathan Driedger from FarmLink Marketing. How are you doing today, John?
Doing fine, thanks, Sean.
John, we're going to talk about agronomy, or do you want to talk about the markets? Which one?
Why don't we stick to markets?
Okay, we'll stick with the markets. Okay, so far, harvest yields on pulses have been quite variable. We've got some good yields, we've got some very, very poor yields. Where does that all phase or come out in terms of pulse marketing decisions as we get this extra windshield time in the combine to think about all these things?
Yeah, well, and I guess for starters, Sean, I mean, one of the biggest things about marketing decisions, it's hard to make a general statement, and particularly in a year like this where yields are so variable from one farm to the next, and the right marketing decisions will be influenced not just by that farm's yields, but crop mix and all kinds of individual factors, bin space, cash flows, debt servicing needs, and all those sorts of things. So it's a little hard to give real specific, generalized advice, but I think some things that growers keep in mind here with the pulse markets in general here this fall is one of the things we're seeing is just tremendous demand here at the start of this crop year, and it kind of goes back already to the strength of this pulse market that we had last season, second half of the crop year. India's pulse crop falls short of expectations with their winter crop. Shortage of pulses all worldwide draws our pulse supplies, our old crop pulse supplies, down to essentially nothing, and leading to this great pent-up demand here for our own pulse harvest here this coming fall. And all this was kind of already starting to take shape with some pretty decent new crop contracts back in the spring. Of course, expectations had been for better yields than we have overall, and now the shortage has only just been amplified here as our own harvest is going to fall short of what expectations were, say, back in late winter and early spring. And so it's kind of having this situation where it was already kind of geared up for a high price, strong price, good demand window, and yet now we've sort of added a layer of supply shortage on top of that. So that's kind of where the root is of this real strong demand and strong prices here as even after we've gotten into harvest. So often you might have expected values to kind of start peeling off as the combines kind of start to get rolling, and so far we haven't really seen much of that yet in, for example, yellow peas and lentils, although, just this week, I think we're starting, easing back a bit on the red lentils and the yellow peas, but certainly it's taken longer and not to the extent that one might have expected, typically as you start heading into harvest, and especially given some strong pricing.
So given all that, does this demand equation feel sustained? Are we kind of, a lot of times in the markets we talk about, we're not really sure where demand's going to go, and it feels weak. Does this feel like demand it's got some strength to it here for maybe long term, whatever that long term is?
Yeah, and that's a good question, Sean. There's a couple parts that we're going to watch here real closely. And first of all, all these crops kind of have their own stories. So there's kind of a couple dynamics that influence all pulse markets. But yellow peas, red lentils, green lentils, they all kind of have their own dynamics as and elements of their own story that shape it as well. But if you're going to sort of generalize a little bit, there's a couple ththings I think that we're going to be watching here going forward, and one of them is just trying to get as good a sense as we can of what the actual size of that crop is. You mentioned at the outset about how variable yields are, and that just creates some a bit of a challenge to just know exactly how big that crop actually is. The sensitivity of markets to maybe a slightly higher or slightly lower final crop size. There's a higher sensitivity when markets are tight and demand is strong, and there's urgency as buyers try and get coverage and so forth, which is kind of what we're going through right now. So that's something we'll have to really watch, and it is a little more challenging when not only yields are variable, but how many acres, for example, got written off and those sorts of things. You never really have a great sense of that till the dust settles after the fact. So that's one of the things that's going to influence prices from a demand perspective. we know that there's this big wave of demand and buying interest at the beginning of the season. We expect there's going to be a bit of a lull here, probably once we start seeing some of this product start hitting overseas shores, which you might expect, as big supplies start getting to their destination markets, and there's inventories that need to be worked through and those sorts of things. And so it would be, as some of these purchases start getting filled and product starts moving, we would expect some lull in pricing. So one of the things we'll be watching for real closely then after that is how deep is the buying interest at, for example, these prices, or what kind of price, as they sort of come back again, as they sort of started working through these initial inventories. And so that'll be one of the key factors to watch. Now, part of that then, as you think further out, I mean, India, for example, is just so monumentally important for so many pulse crops. People are watching their weather real closely, and the monsoon rains, and so some talk about a bit of dryness, and how does that potentially impact their winter acres and their winter crop and so forth. So, there certainly is a lot of demand, a lot of buying interest. But to the extent that maybe some of these end-use countries, India, for example, or the Middle East, if there's sort of anticipation that there's maybe bigger crops, coming further down the line, you kind of go as hand to mouth as possible. In which case, maybe the depth of buying at these sorts of prices, maybe there's a bit of a finite window, months or first half of the crop year, whatever it may be. But having said that, given how tight these pulse markets are already, if there's some signs that maybe India's winter crop is going to come a bit short, or maybe, the Middle East, production isn't going to be what people expect, and you just sort of continue on with this extremely tight supply situation, potentially the prices could continue to stay extremely high for a longer period of time. But you sort of start getting this element of weather and so forth further out. So, obviously lots of question marks. And, in the context of extremely high prices, so certainly the demand is there in the shorter term, but some of the things we're watching, some question marks in terms of can these sorts of values be sustained, sort of indefinitely as you think further out, later on in the crop year into winter, spring, and so forth.
Yeah, so a question on estimating the size of the crop. So you mentioned there's a lot of variability that causes challenges in terms of estimating how big the crop is. So sounds like an odd question, but I'll ask it to you anyway. In a situation like this where demand is strong, so prices are reasonably good, and a variable crop, does the market tend to overestimate inventory or underestimate inventory typically?
Well, I think probably what we're seeing right now, Sean, is I think that as harvest has gone on, I think we're probably seeing crop size estimates, particularly probably for red lentils and yellow peas, probably creeping up a little bit from what were, of course, very, very low expectations. Now, I don't think it's a matter of, geez, there's just way, way more of these crops out there than people were thinking, but rather more just, probably heading into harvest, expectations were pretty low. And as much as there's been a lot of poor yields, there have been some better yields. And so if I was going to lean one way, maybe leaning towards a little better than what had been maybe expected going in. But, having said all that, I think, in terms of the market, the market digests and absorbs these things pretty quickly as well. So it hasn't been, for example, a situation where there's just far more out there than people thought, and the market's caught flat-footed. It's not that case, but maybe just more leaning towards maybe nudging up slightly some of the expectations from maybe what had been thought a few weeks ago, for example, before the combines really got rolling.
Yeah. So when you look back on 2015, what's the biggest surprise in this market?
Well, I think one of the surprises that we've seen is just how strong the buying and interest and demand has been, even once harvest has really gotten well underway. And we think about red lentils, green lentils, even peas. The natural tendency you'd think would be for prices to pull back as you start getting harvest selling and farmers become more comfortable selling. Of course, they're a little cautious selling prior to harvest, given the challenging crop conditions. And there's just been a really strong buying interest, and prices actually have been increasing in a lot of these markets, even as the crop has been coming off and farmers have been selling into it, and in some cases fairly aggressively. So I think that certainly is a testament to the depth of demand for Canadian pulses here through this fall shipping window. So that has been a surprise in the sense that the prices actually were appreciating, not unsubstantially. In a fairly meaningful way, we saw some pretty good price increases again as farmer selling was steady into high prices, and so that would be I would say a bit of a pleasant surprise. Whereas the expectation might have been, for example, holding steady, maybe you'd expect some pullback and so forth, and just a testament to the depth of buying and interest in getting end users getting their hands on Canadian pulses and short covering on the part of buyers who maybe had a harder time sourcing supplies than they thought because, of course, some of the challenging crop conditions and so forth.
Well, and in the pulses, because there is some variability in the prices from planting to harvest back to planting again. We always have this winter where everyone's going to plant. They threaten to plant the whole farm to lentils or green peas or whatever have you. What's your dark horse for the winter of 15? Which of all the crops in the pulse complex has the most potential price-wise for you?
Well, I think one of the things that's really going to make a big impact is getting some sense of what's going on in India over the winter. So that'll have a big shape in terms of just pulse interest in general. But that also then will help drill down in terms of, for example, what's the prospects for red lentils versus, say, green lentils or peas. And I know there's a lot of different things that move into the decision for an individual farm in terms of what's the right crop to plant. The other one that we'll be really watching going forward in terms of the depth of demand from China for yellow peas. Everyone talks about India, and yet China is a huge buyer of yellow peas. So those are a couple of the things that I think will really tell us a lot in terms of how things shape up for 2016 for that coming crop year. One of the things we do know is that ending stocks for red lentils, green lentils, peas will be basically drawn down to minimal levels. So the market is going to be needing acres for all of those crops because we'll just be pretty much out of those supplies based on strong demand and tight supplies. And so it really will be a bit of a function of okay, what's going on in these overseas markets and their own production, and how does that shape the extent that they need Canadian pulses, what kind of volumes. So I guess in my mind, I think it's a little early to sit there and sort of bet on one horse or the other. I think we know what we're going to be watching for over the coming months, and that'll help us, try and coach our clients in terms of which crops make sense in their farms, or at least from a market outlook perspective, how does that shape the other things like agronomics and so forth that also obviously are part of the planting decisions.
So with ending stocks and all those complexes being so low, we could see a massive increase in pulse acres in 16?
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily guaranteed, because I think one of the things we saw this last year is there was a pretty strong incentive for pulse acres to increase dramatically in Western Canada as well. Pulses were penciling out real well for most growers in Western Canada, but there's also agronomic limitations. There's limitations of getting hands on quality seed. There's the value of pulses relative to other crops. So there's a lot of moving parts. Certainly we saw a big increase in lentil acres this past spring, and a big part of it, certainly the market signal was there to do it. Of course, challenging crop conditions pared back considerably what the potential crop size would have been. In the case of peas, we didn't really see as big an increase in acres as we thought, partially because of how lentils looked fairly good. So there's just a lot of moving parts. Certainly the market incentive very well could be there to increase lentil acres, but it was there last year. So maybe to a certain extent, I think the pace of growth, it'd be reasonable to maybe see that the pace of growth maybe isn't as large as just looking at prices, for example, now through harvest would suggest they might be. Of course, it's a long ways away, but again, agronomic limitations and simply the relative profitability of what, for example, new crop lentil contracts look like compared to what the other planting alternatives are. So again, a lot of moving parts between now and when those decisions get made, and a function of, again, growing conditions overseas and so forth. So yeah, lots of moving parts here, but certainly given how high prices are currently, a lot of factors to watch here that could cause the pendulum to swing, both ways.
John, thanks a lot for joining us for this episode of the Pulse School, and look forward to talking again in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure, Sean.